This
morning's announcement on Russian TV was dramatic. 6 British spies posing as diplomats expelled for subversive activities. And here they are at the airport. Except that was in early August. They were forced to leave after Britain expelled the Russian defense attaché and 5 other Russian diplomats in May, tit for tat. Elementary, my dear Watson, as one of the statues at the British Embassy in Moscow might have said. Not who done it, but why and when they done it. It was 4 months ago that the British ambassador was called to the Russian Foreign Office. The British deny that their diplomats are spies and say the Russians are just making a big fuss now for propaganda reasons. Because today the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary are in Washington preparing to meet President Biden. They'll discuss whether to allow Ukraine to use UK and US supplied long-range missiles to hit Russian targets not just in Ukraine but inside Russia, as the Ukrainian president has long sought.
Putin
and his accomplices must feel all the problems that war brings. The war must become significantly harder for Russia. This is the only way to make Russia accept that the war must be brought to an end. The war must end in a just way, based on international law.
Ukrainian forces have used US-supplied HIMARS, which have a 48-mile range, to strike Russian military targets in Kursk inside Russia. The UK is now considering letting Ukraine fire air-launched Storm Shadow cruise missiles with a 155-mile range across the border, while the US may now let Ukraine fire ATACMS missiles, which have an 186-mile range into Russia.
If this decision is made, it will mean nothing less than the direct participation of NATO countries, the United States and European countries, in the war in Ukraine. This is their direct participation, and this, of course, significantly changes the very essence, the very nature of the conflict.
That not very veiled threat comes after, according to US and UK intelligence, Iran secretly sold around 200 ballistic missiles to Russia for use in Ukraine. The very public US and UK dilemma about the use of their missiles has taken on more than just military import.
Obviously, there's been a lot of background briefing and public speculation, some of that encouraged by the Ukrainians. And I think that has, if you like, raised the significance of it beyond its mere tactical value, because it means that it's being seen as signalling Western resolve and support or not. It's also, I think, slightly exposed some differing opinion between NATO allies, which probably they would have preferred to have kept private.
Today, the Russians said they've recaptured 10 settlements that Ukraine had taken in Kursk. They're trying to regain the propaganda and diplomatic initiative too, and make the British and Americans think twice before giving Ukraine license to pursue the war further into Russian territory.
Lindsay Hilson, well, let's go now to our Washington correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy, who's outside the White House ahead of Sir Keir Starmer's meeting with Joe Biden. Siobhan.
Well, Matt, the Prime Minister is due to arrive imminently for his one-on-one meeting with Joe Biden. It will be Keir Starmer's first official visit here to the White House. The fact that he's doing it now, chosen to come now, as opposed to waiting a week or so when he could have sat down with Joe Biden at the UN General Assembly in New York, where they would be together, underscores, I think, not just the importance of the special relationship between the UK and the US, but the importance also that Keir Starmer attaches to making an urgent decision around allowing Ukraine to use US and UK long-range missiles to penetrate deeper inside Russia. That we know that Keir Starmer is arriving here erring on the side of wanting to give Kyiv the green light. He wouldn't on the way over confirm that decision, but nor would he rule it out. But he very much wants and needs Joe Biden's blessing for this, for 2 reasons. Because Britain's Storm Shadow missiles that we heard about in Lindsay's package there those missiles are reliant on US technology for their targeting, but also because Keir Starmer wants any such move to be made, any such decision to be made in coordination with the United States.
And do we have any idea, Siobhan, what Joe Biden will say to Sir Keir in the Oval Office?
We don't really. We know that when Joe Biden was asked earlier on this week on Tuesday whether or not he planned to lift restrictions, his answer was, we're working that out right now. He didn't rule it out either, in other words. Earlier today, I listened in to John Kirby, the National Security Council advisor, give his press conference to us journalists. He was obviously asked there about it, and he said this: there has been no change to our policy with respect to long-range strike capability inside Russia, which, as we know, the US line is that they are against it because they are fearful of being dragged further into the war and provoking Russia. Worth noting, of course, that every time they've had those fears in the past about the provision of planes and missiles and tanks, that they've overcome those fears, and there hasn't been a great retaliation from Russia like the threats that it is making now. Certainly, John Kirby says that it will be a topic for discussion, but expect no announcement today. Zelensky, of course, on his Twitter thread today, is urging for strong decisions off the back of this meeting.
Which I think is about to take place. We saw them all going in, Siobhan. Better hurry up. Thanks very much there. Now, Germany has supported Ukraine from the beginning of the war, despite its industries relying heavily on cheap Russian gas. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz famously declared at Zeitenwende a historic transformation of its commitment to help Ukraine with arms and cash. At the same time, Berlin has been particularly concerned about goading Russia into a wider war. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the German ambassador to the UK, Miguel Berger, and I started by asking whether his government thinks that Vladimir Putin was bluffing when he said that NATO risked igniting war with Russia itself.
In the end, Matt, we don't know if he's bluffing, but it is very important that we reject that notion to be at war with Russia. That's definitely not the case. And if you look at international law, it is absolutely clear that Ukraine has the right to defend itself. And this right to self-defense also includes striking on Russian soil.
In that case, why doesn't the German government allow Ukraine to use Taurus missiles? These are missiles with a range of 300 miles, I believe. The Ukrainians are desperate to get their hands on them because they are fast and they're precise. The Germans have them and you won't give them.
I would argue differently, because what we have delivered, there we have allowed Ukraine to use them. For example, the HIMARS or the howitzers we have delivered. We have given in May already the permission to Ukraine to use these weapons also against attacks coming from Russia. And as I said, in international law, it is clear for us, while Taurus is a different issue, because Taurus, as you say, has a very long reach, 500 kilometers from Ukrainian soil. It could strike Moscow directly. This is a very sensitive discussion, and the Chancellor has decided that for the time being there will be no deliveries.
But if the targets hit by the Ukrainians using, American, German or British missiles for that matter, are purely military, and that would be the deal, what's wrong with that? That's within international law, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's why we have given in May already the permission to use the German weapons. And our legal view is also, in the moment we give the weapons to the Ukrainians, they become Ukrainian weapons, no longer German ones. And
that's not the way the Russians see it, by the way.
That's not the way the Russians see it, but that's why also we reject the Russian notion of any direct involvement in this conflict.
I mean, it comes down to the question that we posed literally in the first day of this war, and we're posing it again. Is NATO, is the West, including the German government, more interested in helping Ukraine win this war or more afraid of igniting a wider war?
Obviously, responsible leaders have to take into account the possible risk of an escalation. That has always been done in a very careful way. But if you look what we have delivered over the years, it has been what Ukraine needs.
But not enough. They keep asking for more, and it keeps getting delivered too late.
Obviously, but it has been a step-by-step approach, because we have also to be cautious, and everybody has to understand, if Ukraine is in war with a nuclear power like Russia, the West has to be cautious with every step we take. But definitely, to be clear here, Matt, we want Ukraine to win this conflict. And we want Ukraine to be in a position at the moment when we will reach the necessity of a diplomatic solution, that Ukraine is in the strongest possible negotiation position.
Is it not the case that whether we like it or not, and the risks are obvious for everyone to see, we are sliding slowly to a situation where maybe a confrontation with Russia becomes unavoidable because of the nature of the weapons that we're sending, because of the desperation of the Ukrainian government to not be defeated in this war, and because of the timing.
Yeah.
An American election coming up on November the 5th, which might mean if Trump wins, that the taps are turned off.
Unavoidable is definitely the word we want to we don't want to have. So we want to be in a situation where the risks are as far as possible under control. And you have mentioned the US elections, absolutely. And that is something that Putin is also looking to. And that's why we are working, for example, in the G7, we are working on a 50 billion package for military aid for Ukraine for the next year. So what we try to do is give Ukraine long-term assurances of our support. But at the same time, Matt, we have to be careful with what we are doing.
I've just come back from Berlin. There's growing disquiet amongst the German population and also parties, opposition parties in parliament, about aid, military and financial aid to Ukraine. Is the German public shifting against this war?
Not if you look at the polls. It's more or less the same like in the United Kingdom, that we have maybe 65% supporting Ukraine. But yes, you are right. We have two parties from the extreme left and the far right who are more or less repeating Putin's speaking points. This is a debate, but it will not change the attitude of the German government.
Ambassador Berger, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to the former US ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, who is currently in Kyiv at a conference about the war. And I began by asking him how close the American administration and indeed the government here are to allowing long-range missiles to strike targets inside Russia.
I think they actually are very close. It's just that the Biden administration is looking for some climb down, some face savers, some justification, because they've maintained this irrational blockage on long-range use for this amount of time. They need to have some reason to change. I think they're getting there, and I think this will actually change.
But, I mean, there are the warnings from Vladimir Putin that if these were to be, long-range missiles used against Russian targets inside Russia, this is effectively Russia at war with NATO. I mean, do you think that's entirely him bluffing, or could it be something more serious?
No, it's Putin doing what he always does, which is saying things that are intended to influence our behavior. If by threatening that, he can get us not to provide long-range capabilities to Ukraine, then he'll do that. It doesn't mean he will actually perceive Russia to be at war with NATO or do anything different than he's already doing.
Right.
He's trying to prevent us from taking a measure.
But how can we be so sure? Because the Russian public already thinks they're at war with NATO. The government in Moscow is behaving as if it's at war with NATO, right? So this is serious stuff.
Let's pull that apart. I mean, in one sense, you are absolutely right. Putin presents this as Russia defending itself against NATO, NATO's war against Russia. And this is what the public in Russia hears. The reality, of course, is quite the opposite, that Russia has decided to launch a war against Ukraine, and the West has studiously avoided getting directly involved in this war, and that continues to be the case. And Putin knows that full well. So the rhetoric that he's employing is not about reality. The rhetoric that he's employing is about trying to deter the West from actually helping Ukraine.
Okay, so what if we allow the Ukrainians to use NATO long-range missiles inside Russia and they hit civilian targets by accident?
That would be a mistake and a terrible thing. I think we should be holding ourselves, first off, and the Ukrainians to the highest standards, which is to say that there are legitimate military targets, air bases, airplanes, fuel depots, logistics hubs that should be targeted by Ukraine inside Russia because Russia is using them to attack Ukraine.
But if they get it wrong, if the Ukrainians get it, sorry to interrupt, but if the Ukrainians get it wrong and they hit a civilian target and these things happen in war, or maybe they do it intentionally, we're going to be in a world of trouble.
Well, let's unpack that again, too. First off, it shouldn't be anybody's intention, and quite the opposite. It needs to be our intention to avoid hitting civilian targets. And that has been the Ukrainian pattern to date, and it has been Western guidance to date. Now, accidents do happen, you can imagine that. And then what you do is you take responsibility, you investigate, you seek to prevent. It is the exact opposite of everything that Russia has done so far in this war, which is deliberately target hospitals, schools, elementary schools, shelters where children are being sheltered and labeled as such. So we shouldn't worry about the fact that in a war, sometimes bad things happen. We should worry about the fact that we are doing the right things in helping Ukraine defend itself and win the war according to the laws of war, something Russia is not doing.
Briefly, you were quite critical of the Biden administration in terms of dragging its feet. But if Trump gets elected, the taps might be turned off altogether.
Well, we don't know that. And I think that the way I look at it is Trump always seeks to bargain from a position of strength. And because he accuses the Biden administration of weakness now, he may feel the first step is to rebuild a position of strength. Certainly, that's the idea to try to sell. And you might have seen an op-ed by former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in the Wall Street Journal about a month ago, in which he made exactly that case.
Right,
he said that here's the way you rebuild that position.
Final question, very briefly. Tell me honestly, do you fear that this could lead to a much wider war than we are at the moment?
I worry that inaction would lead to a wider war. Because if Putin feels that he can succeed in Ukraine and is emboldened, he's going to look at other parts of the former Russian Empire and say, well, I deserve this part of Poland, and I deserve to get the Baltic states back. And I'm not satisfied with where we are in Finland. So I think war continues as long as this ideology that Putin has of imperialism and genocide and the right to rule over others. If that is not stopped, we will face a wider war. We always calculate the risks of action. We need to calculate the risks of inaction.
Okay, going to leave it there. Ambassador Volker, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you.